Hello, my name is Yana Kane. I am a graduate student in Fairleigh Dickinson University's Master of Fine Arts program, specializing in literary translation and poetry. I especially love translating poetry for children. I think that that poetry is suffused with the light, with the joy of using uh, the magic of language, of poetry, to discover the world, to discover uh, and explore internal world and external world, and to bring to it the spirit of playfulness, of delight. So in December of 2021, I have recorded for Jill NYC a selection of 3 poems for children that I have translated from Russian into English. At that time, even though I was certainly quite aware of kind of darkness that has been gathering within and over Russia for a number of years, it was still somehow possible for me to separate all the emotions associated with observing that darkness from this sense of delight that I take in the Russian language itself and in the poetry and in the act of translation and sharing of poetry. The intention was that this video was going to be released in the spring of 2022, but unfortunately, we all know what happened at the end of February when Russia escalated conflict with Ukraine to a full-scale and very bloody war. And when it escalated increasingly repressive uh, changes in its internal functioning to become essentially a full-blown totalitarian regime. And so it no longer was really possible, I think, for me or for anybody to think about uh, anything associated with the Russian language, the Russian culture, even such things as children's poetry, as being somehow in a world by themselves, as being somehow completely separate from what was happening in Russia. And so it didn't seem to be appropriate to release that light-hearted and joyful video. And as a translator, I switched. I could no longer really translate the kind of lyrical poetry and the children's poetry that I usually am very drawn to. But instead, in part to keep my own sanity, I started translating protest poetry that is being written in the Russian language, uh, that protests the war, that protests the repressions within Russia itself. And some of this poetry is being written by people who still are within Russia and who are taking an enormous risk by writing and releasing and sharing such poetry. Some of it is being written by people who basically have been forced by the circumstances, by the threats against them, to leave their country. And some are written by people like myself who have lived outside of Russia for many, many years, who are citizens of other countries, but who nonetheless retain a live connection to the Russian language and Russian literature. And I sort of put that joyful video aside. But recently, when I was approached about participating in the upcoming Kid Lit month at Jill NYC, I gave it another thought and I decided to bring back that video. I don't want to give up Russian language, Russian poetry, Russian poetry for children. I don't want to give up that territory to the forces of darkness. But on the other hand, I feel that I can't just share that light-hearted video as it was in December with no reference to that darkness. And so I'm recording this introduction, acknowledging what is happening. And as part of this introduction, I will read you a translation of a poem. The poem it's called A Louse Appears. And this poem is written by Tatiana Wordsky. This poem is closely linked to Russian poetry for children because it is based on, it alludes to and evokes a poem that was written 100 years ago in 1921 by Kornei Chukovsky. That poem is sometimes called in English monster cockroach, sometimes cockroach. But that is a poem that is a beloved classic of Russian literature for children. And that 1921 poem talks about the monstrous cockroach that terrifies and bullies much larger animals simply by how threatening, how aggressive it is, and it becomes a tyrant over them. Eventually, the situation is saved after he demands that all the other animals bring to him their cubs, their children, so that he can have them for dinner, and the terrified animals comply. The situation is saved by a small sparrow who is unafraid and unimpressed, and who just, with a single peck of his beak, dispatches that monstrous cockroach. So Tatiana Wordsky is a Russian poet and a journalist, the very brave journalist who has spoken truth to power for many years. At the end of 2021, she was branded a foreign agent. And after the start of the war in 2022, or maybe more correctly say this vast escalation of the war, she finally left Russia. She currently resides in Georgia, the country in the Caucasus. She wrote this poem, and in it, she clearly, both in its content and also in its use of playful rhythms, playful rhymes, she clearly evokes that poem about the cockroach. So I will read you a few lines of Tatiana Wordsky poem, A Louse Appears, in Russian, and then I will read the English version, my English translation in its entirety. И приходит вошь. И приходит вошь. Ты морщишься, но беды не ждешь. Она раздувается долго, покуда вождь не проступит из-под белесых ресниц. Чесаться поздно, приказано падать ниц. And now the translation. A louse appears. A louse appears. You cringe in disgust, but you do not feel fear. It swells and it swells till a tyrant glares through colorless lashes. It's too late. You don't dare even to scratch. It commands you, that stare, to grovel. Surrender your boulevard and square, the playground, the school bag with crayons and glue. Your son and your daughter, the louse wants them too. Give me and scram, sounds the venomous hiss. Lie prostrate, you wonder how it all came to this. Why didn't I, a screw up, a dumbass, a mug, flattened that louse when it was a small bug. You kept warm and snug at your dacha, your office, a piano bar. Did not see how high that louse was reaching, how far, how it gorged itself, how it drained springtime dry, how that louse planned a war, taking over the sky. You wished not to know, pretended the tale was untrue, but it piled up dead bodies and now stares down at you while you spat in revulsion. It bit everyone just the same. Louse-born typhus burns down the country, a feverish flame. The louse turns your world topsy-turvy. It's taking away your home, your dreams of the future. Now, blue becomes gray. The louse drives you out. You flee blind with fury and shame. You hear within you a whisper, a howl, a shout. That louse shall not live. Stamp it out. So thank you. I hope you enjoy the much more lighthearted video that I've recorded with 3 other translations of poetry. And I also want to thank my husband and editor, Bruce Esri. He always helps me work on my poetry. So thank you very much. And I certainly hope that we will, all of us, return, we will live to see the time when Russian language, Russian literature will somehow return to the state where such dark introductions are not necessary, where somehow that country, that culture will find its way back to light, back to healing, and somehow find a way to contribute to healing of the enormous damage that the war has taken, has wreaked on Ukraine and on the rest of the world. So thank you.
And today I will read for you my translations from Russian into English of poems by 3 different poets. The first of them is Ivan Krylov. He lived in the late 18th, early 19th centuries, and he wrote fables beloved by adults and by children. Many of them are populated by whimsical and amusing anthropomorphic animal characters. There is a monument to Krulov in the central garden of the city where I grew up. The city was called at the time Leningrad and now St. Petersburg. And I, like many children of that city, love to visit that garden and to walk around this monument to look at its pedestal that is decorated with many bronze figurines portraying the scenes from these fables. And it was wonderful to walk around and recognize the characters, recognize the scenes that came into this garden in this 3-dimensional form from the pages of the book that I loved to listen to as a very small child and then to read when I got older. So I will read to you a fable. I will start by reading a few lines of it in English and in Russian, and then I will read the English translation. I will also mention that his fables typically end with a short summary called the envoy, which summarizes the moral of the story. So this one is called The Sow and the Oak Tree. Свинья под дубом. Свинья под дубом вековым наелась желудей до сыта, до отвала. Наевшись, выспалась под ним. Потом, глаза продравши, встала и рылом подрывать у дуба корни стала. The Sow and the Oak Tree. Beneath an oak, a sow pigged out on acorns. then napped under the shady canopy. At last, refreshed, she set her snout to digging, bearing the roots that fed the ancient tree. "Stop, stop," called out a raven from the branches. "The oak tree's roots get injured when you dig." "What do I care if this useless stump does wither? Acorns are all I'm after," said the pig. The oak tree's voice then joined the conversation. "Ingrate," said to the swine the mighty tree, "if you could lift your snout up from your grubbing, you'd see that all the acorns come from me." An ignoramus, mocking education, scoffing at science, is blind, just like that sow, failing to see that on the tree of knowledge ripen the comforts he is enjoying now. And now I will show you actually a photograph of the monument, and in particular the spot on it where it shows the acorns, the oak tree, the sow, and the raven. So bear with me for a moment. I will share my screen and I will show you these photographs. This is the monument, and this is the detail of the monument that shows the oak tree and the raven and the pig grubbing, digging under the oak tree. So now I will go to the second poem. This one is by Boris Zakhoder. He lived from early 20th century to the very end of 20th century and was one of the most popular and beloved children's writers and translators that my generation grew up with. So his writing is both in poetry and in prose, and it is funny, it is imaginative, and it is kind. And his translations were, personally, for me, was the first encounter as a child with the concept of the translation. That's what got me interested in the idea of a translation. When I read both his own poems and translations in his books. The text I will read to you is maybe more of a retelling of his poem than a straightforward translation. And this is because the original is an abecedarian poem. So of course it's built on the structure of the Russian alphabet. So I had to replace the long and improbable list of objects that are alphabetical in Russian with, I hope, an equally amusing, improbable pileup of objects in English that are in the English alphabetical order. The poem is called Termite's Diet. Again, I'll read a few lines in Russian, and then I will read the entire English translation. Диета термита. Говорил термит термиту. Ел я все по алфавиту. Termite's diet. Said a termite to a termite, yes, I really was determined to be disciplined and tried this new alphabetic diet. I ate airplanes, chewed up boats, candy canes, and cashmere coats, munched on desks and dinner tables, easels, feather dusters, gables, gnawed harness right off a horse, fed on houses, of course. I ate inkwells, jelly beans, kettle drums, and limousines. Then I snacked on magazines, napkins, oil cans, pencils, quilts, rubber boots, a pair of stilts, tablecloths, and tambourines, undershirts, vanilla beans, waffles, xylophones, a yurt, and a zipper for dessert. Yet I didn't feel satisfied. Right, there the termite sighed. All these diets are too tricky. I just eat and don't get picky. Now I will talk to you about the third poet. His name is Vyacheslav Leikin. Here's a photograph of the poet. And he was born in 1937. He is, I'm happy to say, alive and well today. He writes for children and for adults. He, in addition to writing poetry and prose, he's also a screenplay writer and an author of theater plays. He is also a wonderful teacher. For several decades, Leikin headed a literary association for kids who write poetry under the auspices of a newspaper for children. And I was fortunate to have been one of his students for several years in the 1970s. And this was one of the most joyful and influential experiences of my whole life today. Vyacheslav Leikin's poetry for children is similar to how he taught us, to his primary teaching method, which is a game, an invitation to play, to explore the possibilities that language offers for having fun, for imagination, for delight. And so I will read to you my translation of a poem, which is called A Meeting, and here it's published in the magazine. I will again start with a few lines in Russian, and then I will read the entire English text. Встреча. За горошкой, за речушкой илистой, где по дому, до дому по тропе извилистой, столько да поль столько, да чуть-чуть еще. Великанчик встретил лилипутище. Meeting. Near a river where the green hills roll, lived a giant who was very small. How small? The smallest of them all. Every day he took his lonely stroll. But one morning he climbed up a knoll. There he saw a Lilliputian who was tall. How tall? The tallest of them all. He sat hunched and huddled in a ball. This tall Lilliputian was so lonely, never made a friend, though he was old. He sat crying. He looked pale and hungry. He could not stop shivering from cold. Seeing this, the giant spoke to him kindly. In my house, it's warm. I have mint tea. We can bake a cake. It would be lovely to have company. Why don't you come with me? So the giant and the Lilliputian baked a cake topped with pineapple rings. Then the giant brought out his collection of seashells and other marvelous things. And he sang a song about how crushing it can be to feel too big, too small. Yet a giant can befriend a Lilliputian. They both know heights don't count at all. Thank you very much. Goodbye.